I launched a campaign last January on a platform of equity, resilience, and sustainability, because that's how I believe we're going to get through the next 10 years. What does equity mean? To me, equity means getting everyone to the point where they can thrive. So it means kids in schools having access to education regardless of the zip code they're born into or the color of their skin. It means older adults having access to the services they need, even if we're in a pandemic, and even more so, even if there's a budget cut, right? The senior services, the DFTA budget is $400 million, which is half of 1% of our budget, but older adults are 13% of the population. So are we equitably, does our budget reflect our priorities and our values in terms of where we want to go? Resilience is the next part of my platform. How do we create, I've been referring to it as both the hardware and the software of communities. Do we have a built environment that supports us for the future? I don't know about you, and luckily I know the why was safe, but I was out of power for 7 days in August. It was very hot. We had no power for 7 days. We have vulnerabilities in our physical infrastructure. Luckily, in the Northwest Bronx, sea level rise is not such an issue for various reasons having to do with hills, mountains, and the Hudson River. But we have 525 miles of coastline in this city. And much of the Bronx particularly, and much of the city is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise over the next decade. In fact, in 2008, I was the CEO of a startup that helped the administration understand that a new development in the Willets Point, or for those of us old New Yorkers, the Shea Stadium area of Queens, was actually not going to withstand sea level rise that it was designed for, and it had to be redone. It was a $3 billion development. And then there's resilience when we talk about people. And these two organizations, and actually the fact that you're working together, goes to resilient communities. So how do we engender and foster community-based organizations to work together so that when we have crises, they can support each other? So that when, for example, my kids' go to SAR, when their school has no power, this was Hurricane Sandy, the kids' school had no power for 7 days, and all the different communal institutions in the neighborhood took a grade so that the kids could continue to have school. During the pandemic, I was asked to help with food resilience. There was a hole. There was food being provided, but not kosher food. So how do we make relationships between organizations and institutions so that everybody can get the food and access to the food that they need? And I worked with our state assembly office, with the Y, with other institutions all the way across the Bronx, with a not-for-profit providing food, with a local caterer who didn't have any work for his people, to put together ways to get everybody food, which was a win-win-win-win. So that's what I think about when I think about resilience. And then sustainability. We can think of sustainability as being able to satisfy our needs today without compromising our needs in the future, right? So when budgets are crunched, cutting CUNY budgets and firing professors from CUNY does not help us in the future, right? Because there's even financially, there's a direct return when you educate kids in CUNY and move and grow the middle class. So that's what I'm trying to do, because I believe that everything that comes out of our city must be measured on the get-go in terms of equity, resilience, and sustainability. So when we are rolling out vaccination sites, the city should make sure that they're equitably distributed, right? They should make sure that we are doing this efficiently. They should make sure, and we can do it beforehand. We don't have to come back on the other side and say, oops, we didn't do this equitably. We can take care of that. I come from a family of strong women. I wanted to tell you a little bit about where I come from. My grandmother, my paternal grandparents were Holocaust survivors. They were kicked off the land, and they were partisans fighting in the forests in Poland. And my father was born in a DP camp and came to this country at age 23. Sorry, I couldn't do the math there. Came to this country in 1970 with $20 in his pocket. And when he came to this country, it was a melting pot. When my grandmother came from Czechoslovakia as a young girl in the 1920s from Czechoslovakia, it was a melting pot. But what David Dinkins told us much later is that this city is not a melting pot. It's actually a gorgeous mosaic. And that's actually one of the ways I think about our district here, District 11. A lot of us, I think, on this call are from Riverdale, but this district includes 6 other neighborhoods: Wakefield, Woodlawn, Bedford Park, Norwood, Van Cortlandt Village, and Kingsbridge, that are also part of the district. And each one has a different set of needs, desires, wants, socioeconomic status. And what I see by speaking to each of the different neighborhoods one by one is that we are sorely missing an equitable distribution of resources across our city. Why is it that we in Riverdale have so many people who live too far from the subway or the bus to get there safely, easily, conveniently? Why is it that Woodlawn carries 11 homeless shelters? Why, not Woodlawn, I'm sorry, I said the wrong one. Wakefield carries 11 homeless shelters. Why is it that Woodlawn doesn't have organizations like the Riverdale Y? It doesn't have physical spaces for its kids to come to after school for theater or basketball or any of the other wonderful things that happen. So each neighborhood is dealing with its own, and that's sort of the heart of equity. And I believe strongly that everything is connected, and that good solutions solve multiple problems at once. So I want to go back to meals and food, because when I think about services for older adults, one of the things I know is that, for example, Meals on Wheels programs used to provide fresh meals. And today they're providing lots of frozen meals, and lots of people don't want them because they're not good, they're not tasty, they're harder to cook, they just don't feel, I guess they just don't feel as warm. But the thing about providing fresh meals to seniors and older adults is it's not just about the fresh meals. Fresh meals improve health. If the fresh meals are cooked locally in the neighborhood, they create economic activity in businesses that maybe have relationships with the organizations and the seniors around. They improve health. And maybe you could even get to the point where you have relationships with farms. And you're not just feeding people, but you're creating ecosystems that solve multiple problems at once. What I bring to the table is experience in the not-for-profit world, the business world, and in government. And I'll explain to you what. As I mentioned, I came from the corporate sector, and I spent a lot of time as an entrepreneur. I was really asking questions that no one had asked yet and solving problems that were far in the future. So for example, I was a pioneer in early internet advertising. So remember the early days, remember the first time you went on the internet? One of my early jobs was to work on internet advertising, so that, and understanding sort of when you click on a banner and what happens. Another one of my jobs was dealing with climate data, as I mentioned before, so that this development by Shea Stadium would be built to withstand rising sea levels. And then I became a mentor to small businesses. And one of the things that I would say would help them with understanding sustainable business models, understanding how to be socially responsible and not just do the business, but do the business in a way that is also good for the community. One of the things I always said to them in talking about building a board for their business, a diverse range of experiences. And there's a Harvard Business School study that shows that boards that contain women outperform boards that don't, that are all men. And so one of the things I would encourage is the encourage of diverse people on the board and women in the board. And I want to transition for 1 minute to 3 numbers that I think are really important for this group to understand. Our city council today has 51 members on it. Of those 51 members today, there are 12 women in city council. So our very progressive New York City only has about a quarter representation of women. And of the 51, there are only 2 moms on council. We do not even have enough women to sit on every single one of the 33 city council committees, let alone, chair them or anything like that. So I do believe that all things being equal, diverse representation is super important. I believe that people with children, that parents lead from a place of compassion and understanding of the needs of future generations, up and down. So with that, I'm actually very pleased to be endorsed by a couple of organizations focusing on bringing women into office. One of them is called Women for the Win, which is a group of media professionals. Vote Mama, which is breaking down barriers across the country and helping women break down barriers by changing legislation to allow for rules. For example, childcare was never able to be paid for by campaign finance. It's not so relevant in New York City, but in the rest of the country it is, because usually it's men running for office and the moms are home with the kids. But what if mom is running for office and dad's at work? So how do you do that? And also 21 and 21, whose goal is it to elect 21 women to the New York City Council, at least 21 women by 2021. So that's some of my my business experience. My not-for-profit experience, I worked for, as a senior executive, an organization called Chazon. Chazon is the largest faith-based environmental organization in the country. I drove the strategic planning process for that organization as the vice chair of the board and the chairman of the strategic planning process. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you that came out of that is the fact that the most important thing for us to do right now is understand that we are in crisis. The world is in crisis. And of course, we say that in the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, understanding that we are living through a global climate crisis. And it is our values that compel us to respond to that crisis in a dear way. And I take that to heart. Having worked with this not-for-profit, having shepherded it through the pandemic, there's a large, it owns a large retreat center and lost millions of dollars, but yet the institution still exists and is still thriving even through the pandemic. And lastly, I worked for the government. In the last administration, I was brought into Comptroller John Liu's office to build a constituent management system for the Comptroller's office. So what does that mean? The Comptroller does financial oversight. He's like the CFO of the city. And the Comptroller needs to engage with 8.5 million New Yorkers. And he didn't have a system to do that. So I used my business and technology background and built a system so that the different members in the public affairs office understood how to engage with their constituents in a timely manner, efficiently, and handle all of the issues that they were asking about. Which brings me to our council district. It is really important for the council member not just to have big vision, and my vision of a resilient, equitable, and sustainable city is a big one, because we need to change a lot of systems to get there, but also to be grounded and rooted in our council district and understand that the primary goal is constituent management and making sure that everyone is heard, that their voices are amplified, and that everything that they need is taken care of. And I have the background and experience, both from my government work, from my nonprofit work, and from my corporate work, to do that and do it in an efficient and systematized way so that people feel very heard. I think I just want to round out the conversation with just explaining some of the organizations and some of the people that I'm thrilled to be endorsed by. To answer my original question that I asked at the beginning, which was, how are we going to thrive? How are our children going to thrive in a world where their school systems are failing, the housing systems are failing, and we know that the air they breathe is making them sick? We're going to thrive by electing leaders who think differently from the leaders who got us into this situation in the first place. Okay, and that's the kind of thinker and leader I am. And so some of the organizations that have endorsed me, one is No IDC. No IDC was instrumental in electing State Senator Alessandra Biaggi. The American Institute of Architects and Open New York, who are very involved and engaged in our built environment. Concerned Citizens for Change, which is a local group that also worked against the IDC. The Jewish Climate Action Network, the New York League of Conservation Voters, the Jim Owls Liberal Democratic Club, Bronx Climate Justice North, North Bronx Racial Justice, And then I'm super proud to have on the team endorsements from Helen Rosenthal, the current city councilwoman on the Upper West Side, Elizabeth Crowley, former council member and also founder of 21 and 21, my mentor and social justice warrior, Ruth Messenger, who was the former Manhattan Borough president and also councilwoman on the West Side, Melissa Mark Viverito, former speaker of the council, first Latina to hold that position, and Oliver Coppell, who pointed out to me that he was elected 10 times in this area. And I'm very happy to have him on his team. He is always available for questions that I have, and always has important advice, because he was there when every bill was written or deliberated, so he can help me. He's helped me a lot navigate this system. You know, I launched this before the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit a year and 1 day ago, very closely in our house, I thought about, what does this mean? What does this mean for this council run? And really talking about equity, resilience, and sustainability a year and a half ago was a lot harder than it is today, because as soon as the pandemic hit, we ran into crises of equity, resilience, and sustainability in such a way that people now understand the importance of fighting forward and building for our future so that we are prepared for anything. And I believe that I am. And I'm happy to take any questions. I saw things pop up, but I was not able to read them as I was speaking. So.
Okay, so we're going to start the Q&A. Let's start with the questions that were in the chat. So I'll read them and you can then answer. The first one is, even before the pandemic, commercial landlords were keeping rents so high that small businesses could not sustain themselves. New small businesses can't afford to open here. More and more storefronts are vacant while the landlords get tax breaks. What will you do to address that?
Yeah, thank you for that. And that actually goes, that's a pre-pandemic issue, another issue only exacerbated by the pandemic. So in the 1970s, the pendulum was swinging to sort of sustain landlords. We were having real estate crisis, and the landlords were the ones that needed rescue. So we're still living today with an anachronistic system of giving tax breaks, as you mentioned, to landlords who have vacancies. Oh, poor landlord, there's no one renting your store. We're going to give you a break. That needs to stop, because we know that businesses in storefronts build communities. They make them safer. They support the small businesses, which are the backbone of our neighborhoods. So number one, we really need to undo those exemptions for the vacancy, and then we need some kind of commercial rent reform to pull the pressure off of the landlords putting pressure on the small businesses. And we need to penalize them for having vacant storefronts. I mean, that's what has to happen. I think in the mid 80s, I think it was 1984, Council Member Messenger was the one to put commercial rent reform initially, up for discussion, and it's time for it to come back.
Okay, I'm going to read a couple more questions from the chat, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. The next question in the chat was, what city council committees would you want to serve on and why? Thank you.
Oh, great question. Thank you. So I actually want to introduce a new committee based on my experience during the pandemic working on food insecurity. I realized that I want to introduce a new committee on food justice, because sorry, someone will answer that. Because food falls through the cracks. New York City feeds 240 million meals across senior centers, schools, hospitals, all sorts of things, and nobody pays attention to food and food systems. And our food system is so incredibly vulnerable, as we saw. So I would like to introduce that and then lead it. I'd also like to be on the transportation, sanitation and solid waste, and of course, environment committee. I can also be on the resilience committee, and then I could also leverage some of my business skills on the tech committee and some of the others.
Okay, one more question from the chat, and then we'll go to someone who has a hand raised, and then we'll open it up, and then we'll go back and forth. So the next question is, please address the rising crime rate in this area! Exclamation point.
Exclamation point is right. One of the things that that Oliver Coppell said to me is the only thing he was sure of every single year that he represented the district was that people would ask for more police in the 5-0. That we need more police, that we need them on the streets, that we need them engaging in the communities. And as you know, and I'm sure it could be one of the questions that we would discuss, we're dealing with, the hashtag defund the police conversation and the systemic racism built nationally, not just in the Bronx, but nationally into our police force. So how do you make us safer and address all of those issues? So, and I think there are a couple of things to do. We need to give resources to organizations that we want to improve. So we need to give them resources and focus them more specifically on their jobs. So, I mean, I didn't make up these policy notions, but the concept of taking mental health work away from the NYPD to other kinds of trained social workers and trained mental health experts who can address it more efficiently than them will allow the police force to then more focus on safety, which is their job. So when I look at the NYPD budget, and I'm just sort of jumping to that because I think those things are all connected. I see a tremendous amount of waste and inefficiency. $900 million of the budget is overtime budget. It seems to me that anyone who needs $900 million in overtime isn't managing their resources appropriately. We also have situations where the NYPD has received more than its fair share of budget. And again, as I mentioned before, our budget needs to reflect our values and our priorities. So if I'm cutting DFTA and I'm cutting health and hospitals, I'm cutting everything else, why don't, NYPD has to be effectively. I also would like to see police from our neighborhoods and police on the streets engaged in our neighborhoods. And I think part of that has to do with how we hire policemen, how we place them, and also a cultural shift that has to happen. And they need to be given the resources to implement that cultural change to do it. So maybe take some of the $900 million overtime budget and use the people you have and engage, because I think that there is a sense of fear on now police engagement with communities, and that is causing us to be less safe. And the last thing I'll say on that is that we often in this council often doesn't look at the impacts of programs when it makes decisions. So I'll give you an example from last summer. One of the first things that was cut was the summer youth employment program. Because doesn't summer youth employment sound extra, right? It sounds like something we won't need if we're in a pandemic. But actually, summer youth employment, the theory of change and the results of summer youth employment is safety. Those are one of the results. You have teenagers in meaningful jobs preparing for their future and not just hanging around with nothing to do. So if we look at the outcomes and the results, for example, for safety and rising crime, and think about the other programs that we can implement that will achieve those results, I think we will do better as a city. And if we think about the way that things solve multiple problems at once, we will come out in a better place.
Okay, thank you. Brenda, did you have a question? I see your hand is raised, so you need to unmute yourself to ask your question. Brenda?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. I'm concerned with the mail situation in Riverdale. It's getting a little better in terms of delivery, but what is concerning me most is that there's a lot of crime resulting with the boxes where we put our mail in. So they're putting some glue and trying to get out checks. I haven't been impacted yet, but it's very scary, and a lot of people have been. And it's very hard as a senior to always go and mail your letters at the post office. So I was wondering, there were empty buildings, storefronts on Johnson. Could they put a satellite post office where we could mail our mail safely without worrying if our mail is going to get to where it has to get, without somebody trying to steal our checks? that we're mailing in good faith to pay our bills. And I'm very concerned about it. Every time I go mail a letter, I do it before 2, never on the weekends, never at night. But I don't think we should have, this is a very big worry with everything else. So I'm just bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you. So the role, thank you for that. And you're right. It should not be something that we should worry about. I think it goes to safety. The role of the city council member is to amplify the voices of the constituents. I mentioned the constituent management, the systems and the tools. Unfortunately, the mail system is federal. So what I would say to you is what I would do as council person, and we can even do it right now when I hang up on this, is I would make sure that all of our complaints, number one, are put into our congressman so that he can represent it at the federal level. Number two, our local NYPD needs to be engaged. Our local community boards need to be engaged with this. Maybe they can engage directly with the boxes, with the post boxes. Maybe they could check on it, but it's about amplifying, taking your voice and going to the PD and saying, we have to fix this. We have to deal with this right now.
Well, excuse me, can I say something? I spoke with Bowman's office and I registered my thoughts, and I'm trying to get people to call if it's their concern too.
Great.
And maybe then they will do something. And if anybody wants Bowman's number, I will give you the number to call, because we really have to do something. This is not, I don't even think that it's necessarily a police issue. I don't know what issue it is, but Bowman is a congressman, right?
Why don't you put yes, Bowman is the congressman. You could put the number in the chat so anyone wants to call. And I believe in that. Multiple voices amplify your message in a big way.
I'll get it and then I'll put it in the chat. Bowman's number. What's his first name?
Jamal.
Jamal Bowman. Okay, I'm gonna go and get it and put it in.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Let me read you a question now from the chat.
Oh, could I just say something having to do with what Brenda brought up?
Certainly.
Okay. 2 years ago at the Y, the police department, somebody came and spoke and gave us special pens that you can't erase. What was happening, they're stealing the mail for checks. And if you have this special pen, they can't erase, they erase your regular pen, and then they could write any kind of check to themselves. So people were using that. I called up the police department a while after. They don't have it anymore. That's something to look into. I don't send checks anymore because of that, but they're not after your letters or any junk mail. They're after checks that they can erase and send to their mother, or just take out your whole bank account. And that did happen to people. So maybe some of that overtime money.
Yeah, they could buy the pens with the $900 million.
They could buy.
Archie,
Yeah.
Archie, it's Judith. Can I add to this?
No, yeah, you want to add to this? And then I do want to get to, there are other people that have questions, and to be fair, I want to get to them. But Judith, why don't you say?
Very quickly, I had my checks washed chemically twice. And you can get those pens from Amazon. And Marge, tomorrow I'll give you the name of the pen and you can send it out to the seniors.
Okay, we'll put it in the newsletter.
Listen, there are federal postal police that that have to deal with this, but maybe we can get our local community board safety committee and the NYPD engaged in it.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the chat, and then Judy Graff, I'm going to go to you right after. So I'm going to go back to the chat. What are your ideas for addressing climate change? What can the city council do?
And who asked that question? Because I don't
Jane
even
House.
Jane House, I don't even know you. It was a plant, right? Listen, everything I do is driven by the climate crisis. Last year, our city council passed the #1 biggest carbon emission reduction bill in the whole country. It's called Local Law 97, and it has to do with pulling emissions and dirty energy out of large buildings, which are 5% of the buildings, but 80% of the pollution. Governor Cuomo right now is attacking that bill. We need to defend that bill, strengthen it, move it forward, and we need to include people in a just transition. What I would like to do is lead in the city council on climate and the climate crisis. Again, everything is connected. I want to decarbonize our transportation systems. I want to decarbonize and clean up our air. The health discrepancies in our neighborhood for COVID is directly related to our air quality. I want to make green spaces everywhere so that we reduce what's called the heat island effect, which means, and you might have experienced this in your life, that it is hotter on a city street than it is in a park. In the summers right now, New York, in the Bronx, it could be 20 degrees hotter in a building on an asphalt street than it can be outside of the city on green grass. And when it gets that hot, people die, which is why New York City gave out 75,000 air conditioners, or they tried to give out 75,000 air conditioners last year. So this is the heart of everything that I'm doing, because we want to envision a place that when your grandchildren are adults, they are living beautiful, resilient lives in this city. So I want to tackle it from our impact on the environment, Local Law 97, air pollution, health impacts right now, and then building the city in a way so that we're taking it all into account and we can create beautiful communities.
Thank you. Judy Graff, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? And then I'll get to you, Lee, but Judy's had her hand raised for a while.
I just want to add on to what Brenda said, because I don't know if any of you are on Facebook, but the substation post office on Capock Street every other day is closed, or they're open 3 hours, and it's just out of control. And I really do agree that we need another substation in the Johnson Avenue area. But who's going to, man these things if we don't have enough money to have somebody in the station? How do we, who should we address this to?
Yes, so the funding for the station would come from the federal government. And now I guess that Biden has rethought the management of the post office. I guess we have a better chance at better service as users of the post office. I also think there's tremendous opportunity from a real estate perspective. So we're in a vulnerable position right now because lots of storefronts, as you mentioned, are empty. And we're in a vulnerable situation because developers can come in and buy real estate, on the cheap. So I think that what we need to do is mobilize ourselves to use empty space for good of the community. So maybe it's a satellite, maybe it's even a temporary post office for now. Maybe it's using the spaces for community. Maybe it's using it for public schools so that the kids have more space, right? If they need to be 6 feet distanced and the 30 kids in the classroom, which should be fewer, need 2 rooms, right? Maybe you use space that way. But I think that we need to mobilize. So maybe it would be conversation between the city and the federal government on using spaces differently.
Thank you, Lee. I think your question.
I want to address the issue that Brenda has with post offices and also the vacancy. I believe that in Riverdale, on Johnson and Capock, the majority landlord is the same person, and that's the Freeland Properties. And
yes.
Right? And,
yes.
Right. So
yes.
What can be done to convince Freeland Properties that they need to do something, or why can't there be sanctions against them? Because on Capock, there have been 3 building storefronts vacant for at least, tell me, Margie, what, 5, 10 years? Long time, right? We live in the same building. That's why I went to Margie and Barbara too. But why isn't anyone doing anything? And then, that post office right there, so rinky dinky. So why can't that be upgraded? I know there's a problem with the postal service, and a lot of employees are out sick with the virus, and also because the Master General was a Trump appointee, and Biden has no authority to get rid of him. But the board of directors, I don't know what it's officially called, he has, I think there are vacancies, and he's going to replace them, fill them with his people. So we're hoping, fingers crossed, that LaJoy, I think his name, Louis LaJoy, will be no longer there, and there will be someone who cares about the post office and the people who work for the post office and the employees. But primarily, I'm concerned about what the city council can do about landlords who purposely keep their stores vacant for multiple years. There's no sanction. They can afford to pay the taxes on it. Maybe they should be paid a tax that's higher than an occupied storefront to penalize them. I don't know. I don't know the legality of it.
Okay, let's let Jessica answer the question.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I addressed it before, which is, Lee, you're absolutely right, is that they should face higher penalties for a vacant storefront instead of tax breaks for not having them rented. What's going to result is that rents could go down, which is actually what we want. We need a correction right now. Additionally, you know, maybe mobile mail trucks are a solution, especially right now. Maybe, you know, having something that moves around. But again, that's something that the city can ask for, but the federal government needs to implement it.
Okay, the next question, what is the relationship of our city council person with the community boards? That's from Carol Hervey.
Thanks, Carol. So the community board is supposed to represent the voice of the community. So what we need to, so there's two parts to it. One is the city council person recommends the people to nominate for the community board to the borough president, who does the approval. So there's a relationship between the borough president and the city councilman in populating the community boards. And then the community boards provide the answers to the city council person. So if the question is, you know, if there's a question on land use, on safety, it would be the community board would probably be the first point of interaction. But I think it's the responsibility of the community board, I'm sorry, the council person, pointing to myself, the council person, to make sure that the community board represents the community, right? Are there people with disabilities in the community? Of course there are. Are they on the community board? Are there younger people and older adults in the community? Of course there are. Are there younger people and older adults on the community board? And if it doesn't, then it's like over time, it's the responsibility of the council person working with the borough president to make sure that the board does, that they're engaged, and that when they speak, they actually represent the community.
Okay, I don't have questions in the chat. I don't see hands raised. Does anyone else have questions? Suzanne, you have to unmute yourself.
I would like to ask you a question about the talk of congestion pricing is coming back. We're at a point now where people are leaving the city, which affects our economy. Do you think this is something that should be discussed now, or do we welcome people back and we want them to use our city and bring money in?
Thank you for that. I support congestion pricing because it will make us a healthier city economy. And because the money raised from the congestion pricing is going to fund complete overhauls of the MTA, our capital budget, and all sorts of wonderful things. So what I would ask in this scenario is, number one, are people really fleeing the city, and why? And two, does congestion pricing affect their fleeing or they're not fleeing? So I believe that New York City will come back. It did. All of you remember 9/11. Sometimes I speak to groups if they don't remember that New York City had to come back after 9/11. The city came back. It came back by doubling down on diversifying industry and working towards accepting 1 million more people into the city sustainably. That was the thrust of the work, and also to try and win the Olympics. That helped us too. But I believe that that the money raised from congestion pricing is going to make the city better, because then we're going to be able to have fully ADA accessible subways, and we're going to be able to have electric buses going everywhere and not just up and down one little spine. We'll be able to get cross east west in the Bronx, and it'll do wonderful things for us. So I believe that now is the time. I'm sad that Trump's administration held it up for as long as it did. I'm hopeful that it goes through now. And it's, again, all of these things are connected. And I don't think it will scare away. I don't think it will scare away people. I actually think it will turn out with the net benefit. And if there are unintended consequences, we can fix it. We can tweak it as we go along.
Okay, there's another question in the chat. There are many Con Ed power lines going through trees in Riverdale. Please present a fire hazard. What can be done?
Yes, this is terrible, Jane. Like I said, we had 7.5 days without power this summer. I had to organize Zoom Shiva. My grandmother passed away and we had no power and she was overseas and it was just terrible. It was a pandemic. It was probably the worst week. And I've had COVID and that week was worse. So what can be done? Guess what? Renewable energy. Because if we transition away from the way we engage with our energy system, and we distribute solar panels and windmills and geothermal all over, we will have a much more resilient and robust energy system. There are regulations in place right now that make it really hard for a solar panel on a roof to actually power the building that it's sitting on. That's a state level thing. I'm engaged in trying to break that down. If everybody has access to different kinds of renewable energy because the city builds it and makes it free and makes it cheap and makes it easy, then we won't have to worry about this. We'll still have power lines moving energy, but we'll also have redundancy because we'll have distributed energy that is local. Look, the other conversation also engaged in this locally is, do we bury our power lines? New York, Manhattan buried its power lines in the 1890s. I believe it's 1880s or 1890s. And all of the outer boroughs have the issues that we have here. So areas of Riverdale where we have apartment buildings, the power lines are underground, and areas where we have single family homes, they are not. The question is it cost effective to do it? And what kind of technology exists that we can leapfrog? I have been talking about burying the power lines for 15 years. And then let me tell you something. I was trained by Al Gore in 2007 to talk locally on climate change. This was before I got a master's degree in environmental science and policy. And one of the slides in the Al Gore presentation is a power line with this nest of wires, this awful nest. And the slide says something like, developing countries will never have to do that. They're going to leapfrog the technology. They never put up phone lines because people use cell phones now. They never put up, old telephone lines. So the question really is, how are we going to leapfrog here in the Bronx? Can we leapfrog to something better? And in the meantime, I think it is, we just work with Con Ed to make sure they're responsive and they trim the trees in a healthy way.
Okay, and I think Carol Hervey, do you have a question?
My concern comes back to you and how you represent your constituencies, where there may be this difference between what you personally would want as your goal. And I've seen it at city council meetings where, I represent you, so your voice counts, not mine. I don't know if I'm expressing it properly. You've expressed a few of your status, your opinions or status standing on a few of the topics, What if your constituency doesn't feel the same? Can you stick
So-
to your guns?
So here's my thought process. Constituent management. Are we collecting information about what the constituents want? Right? We get phone calls, we get phone calls. We need a new library, we need a new library, we need a new library, or there's a pothole. And for me, the constituent management is the data that helps you understand what the community wants in a larger level. So if we hear there's a problem with the post office, there's a problem with the post office, there's a problem, this box is sticky, this box is sticky, then okay, then that's what that drives the office. And that's why I think the systems are so important and the data is so important, because that's how we know what it is that we need to fix. There are too many kids in the classroom. Why aren't you promised me that there would be fewer kids in my kids' public school classroom? Why aren't? Well, then that's something that we need to fix, and that bubbles it up to the top. I have a master's degree in environmental science and policy. It's an MPA. It's a public policy degree. And one of the conversations there is, how do you set the agenda and how do you elevate what's most important? And I think that the biggest challenge, Carol, is going to be, for me, balancing what I see as the need in the future based on my understanding of science and my experience there, and what the need of today, right? So maybe it is that, the people in Willets Point around Shea Stadium didn't want to build to withstand climate change. They liked the design as it was then. But then the city needs to step in and say, no, but we're building for the future. So there is compromise involved. But I think, the job is to amplify, and the job is to collect and use that to prioritize where we go.
Okay. I don't see questions in the chat. Does anyone else? Judy, I see your hand raised. Unmute yourself.
You said that you are for congestive pricing, but the last time the amount of money was almost $14 for someone to come in the city. And if someone is disabled and can't take public transportation and wants to drive, do you think that perhaps the price can be lowered? Why does it have to be such a great amount?
So it doesn't have it. One of the questions, I think this goes to what Carol said, how do I think, right? So how do I think, and what is the process? Here's how I think, Judy. Yes, and. Yes, we need congestion pricing. And if you're on low income or you're disabled, you can have, in the same way we have a low income Metro card and we have fares, that's a yes and scenario. It's not a one or the other. We absolutely, accessorized could be exempt. And if you have a handicap sticker, it could be exempt. I mean, this is all absolutely possible and would be exactly the kind of thing that you would say. You would speak up, and then that would make sense.
Hopefully.
Okay. Any other questions? One, going. Okay. Thank you. Again, as we did last time, if you have questions that you think about later, let us know and we'll get them to Jessica and we'll get back and give you answers. So when is our next one? Our next one is next Tuesday. And we will see you then. And thank you very much, Jessica, for your time and for your answers.
Yeah, I'd love you all, everyone, the special election is coming up so quickly. Please tell your friends, and jessicahaller.com/vote has all the information you need about absentee ballot and early voting locations. And the Board of Election has done such a wonderful job with safe, distanced, your own pen. I mean, if you feel comfortable voting in person, you get your absentee ballot now and send it in, and engage with all the candidates, because it is a ranked choice voting. So I hope you rank me first.
Okay, everybody.
Thank you.
Time for dinner. Thank you so much, Jessica. Really appreciate it.
you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm closing us down. Bye.
Bye, good night.